Coming up during the next hour on Aviation Highlights, General Aviation in Rochester, including a look at what general aviation is, what it takes to fly an airplane, where you can learn to fly, and where airplanes to fly are available. Also, some of the ways pilots use their flying skills, and we'll talk with the people who fly these airplanes at the National Warplane Museum in Geneseo.
Hi, I'm Paul Pakusch at the National Warplane Museum in Geneseo. This museum has grown from being just a small grass airstrip in the early 1980s to a living memorial of airplanes that flew in the Second World War and the Korean War. On Aviation Highlights, we'll be looking at this museum and also exploring general aviation in Rochester. First, it's necessary to understand exactly what general aviation is.
When you board a commercial jet for a trip, you're flying a scheduled airliner. You've purchased a ticket, arrived at the airport at a designated time, you've probably changed planes in another city, and arrived at your destination at a designated time. If you were to make the same trip in an airplane like this, and you flew direct without changing planes, and at a time determined by you, you'd be flying in general aviation. General aviation makes up all aviation that is not a scheduled airliner or military. It includes business flights, cargo flights, law enforcement, firefighting aircraft, crop dusters, aircraft used in managing the environment, sport flying, hobby flying, and aircraft used for saving lives. Of course, it's not limited to those either. According to the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, 75% of general aviation is used for business and commercial reasons. Only 3% of these are corporate jets. The rest are flown in single and twin-engine airplanes. The convenience and flexibility of general aviation is what attracts those who use it. There are some 16,000 airports in the United States, and only 500 are served by the scheduled airliners. More than half of the airlines serve just 25 cities. General aviation aircraft can get their passengers or cargo to any one of those 16,000 airports. There are 50 general aviation aircraft for every one scheduled airliner operating, and more Americans use general aviation aircraft than the top 5 airliners combined. So again, general aviation is any aircraft that is not military and not operated as a scheduled airliner.
Some people have the misconception that pilots flying little airplanes are a bunch of reckless barnstormers who get in the way of jets. Nothing could be further from the truth. While there's always a few who will get all the attention and give everyone else a bad name, most pilots are careful, conscientious people who have gone through a lot of training.
In order for someone to become a private pilot, the applicant must be 17 years old and pass one of 3 classes of medical exams. The medical exam is designed to screen out a potentially dangerous medical condition that could cause injury or death if that person suddenly became incapable of controlling the aircraft. A pilot must be able to read, speak, and understand the English language. A pilot will have passed a written examination testing his or her aeronautical knowledge. There are ground school courses and home study courses available to prepare one for this test. A student pilot must log a minimum of 40 hours of flight instruction from a certified flight instructor. Most student pilots log much more than 40 hours before a flight test. When the student pilot and flight instructor agree that he or she has reached the desired flight proficiency, the student will take a flight test with an FAA examiner. After passing the flight test, the student becomes a private pilot. If a private pilot desires to further his or her aeronautical training, he or she can become instrument rated, seaplane rated, multi-engine rated, become a commercial pilot, or getting airline transport rating. Each of these requires further study and training. Of course, there are also other categories of pilots for rotorcrafts, gliders, and lighter-than-air aircraft. There's even a pilot certificate available for recreational pilots, but they have certain restrictions that private pilots don't have.
When you go out to drive your car, you probably just hop in, start the ignition, and drive away. But how many people take the time to check the oil level before they go? Or do they walk around and check all the light bulbs to make sure they're working? Do they check the tires or look for loose parts? Probably not very often, but a pilot needs to do these each time the airplane is being flown. Dennis Cristiano explains.
Hi, I'm Dennis Cristiano for Aviation Highlights. Today we're here with one of the Rochester Flying Club airplanes. We're going to tell you a little bit about a process called preflighting. When you get in your car in the morning to go to work, it's very rare for anybody to walk around it and check the tires, but that's just what a pilot does before he flies any airplane. Walk around the entire aircraft and check not just the tires, but all the control surfaces, the engine, the oil levels, the fuel, and many other aspects of flying in the aircraft that are necessary for flight. That's what we're going to do. We're going to show you a pre-flight and why general aviation flying is so safe. The first thing we're going to do is take a look in the cockpit of the airplane and make sure that all the switches are off and that there's no danger of the propeller turning over while we're examining the engine and the propeller area. We've opened up the airplane and examined the switch panel to make sure that the switches are off and that the controls are free, and we can check them on the outside to make sure that the travel of the control surface is appropriate for the flight. We've also put the flaps down to make sure that the flaps are operating and to allow us to examine the hinges and the moving surfaces that are also critical. One of the most important things is that we've gotten out the checklist. Any good pilot uses a checklist for every operation that he undertakes. The first thing we're going to do is look right here at the flaps and make sure that they're secure and are not coming up or going down too far in the up position. We're also going to be looking underneath to check and make sure that there's no hydraulic fluid leaking out of the braking system and that the tires appear to be inflated properly and that there's no obvious problem with the aircraft. Everything looks pretty good here. The latches are good, the step is good, the flaps are good, and the brakes and the tires look very good. If we do the pre-flight, we check the trailing edge of the wing. Part of that is the flaps and getting out to the right aileron. It's one of the devices on the trailing edge that helps turn the airplane. Actually, it banks the airplane. And we check that to make sure it has full travel up and down, that there's no dings or dents or snags in the cables that operate it. As we round the wingtip, we check the wingtip for nicks, scratch, dents, anything that may hinder its performance, and take a look down the underside of the wing to be sure that it hasn't been bent in a hard landing or that there are no problems that are evident by looking down the straight side of it. Wings come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and you have to take that into account as you examine them. But basically what you're doing is stepping back and making sure there's no apparent damage. The right front leading edge is the part of the airfoil that begins the work of creating lift, and it's very important that it's smooth. We check for nicks, stone chips, and make sure the integrity of the entire leading edge is there. As we get down the wing a little farther, we get to the fuel tanks. And it's important to not only check how much fuel we have on board visually, but to drain the fuel from the lowest part of the fuel system to be sure that there's no water. Water is heavier than fuel and will drain to the sumps. And what we will do is get underneath the wing and with a special little fuel drain fuel from the lowest part, which is this sump. We check and make sure that the fuel that comes out of the sump is not in any way impure or has any sort of contamination in it. The next part of our examination of this airplane prior to flight is checking the oil. Here we have brand new oil. It's up to the proper level, and everything inside looks like it's in its proper place, it's tight, and that there are no leaks. So we know we have enough oil for this trip. As we finish with that, we check out the nose gear, make sure that it's got no obvious defects, the tire's good, the inflation's there, and check the cowling, make sure all the bolts and straps are tight. And we get around to the propeller. Now this propeller does an awful lot of work. It turns at 2,400 RPM, and that creates tremendous stresses in the prop hub and the blades themselves as they pull the airplane through the air. So it's very important to check for nicks and scratches, damage at the end, any kind of unusual abrasion, and to make sure it's just generally in good condition, smooth, and can do the job that's asked of it. There's another area, the lowest part of this fuel system, so we're going to drain some more fuel out of this airplane to make sure that the lowest fuel sump has the proper fuel and that there is nothing inside the fuel that might cause a blockage. As we move around the aircraft, again, we're looking for any obvious problems. Everything looks like it's in very good shape on this aircraft. The leading edges of the wing are smooth. Let's see how much fuel we have. Full tanks. Let's see how the fuel test goes underneath. Another good fuel sample shows that this airplane is in very good condition and well taken care of. As we get out a little farther, we find the stall warning indicator. It's a little tab that sticks down from the wing that determines when the aircraft is in an aerodynamic range, which is called a stall. The left leading edge is much the same as the right. We check for integrity, make sure there's no dents, dings, and get around the wingtip, make sure the same things. Left aileron, check for travel, up and down, make sure there's no snags, operate smoothly. Again, we're checking the flap to ensure that it's secure and in the same position as the flap on the other side. It seems to be in very good shape. The side of the fuselage is smooth, no obvious damage. The antennas seem to be secure, and everything seems fine on the top of the fuselage. Getting back here to the vertical stabilizer, all the attachment points look good, the light's in the right place, the antennas are fine. And we're taking a look at the leading edge of the stabilizer, also a very important part of this device, which enables the pilot to regulate the pitch, nose up and nose down of the aircraft. On the back of the stabilator on this Piper Archer, we have a device called the trim tab. Trim tab makes it easy for a pilot to make adjustments to the pitch of the aircraft, and it has a number of hinges. We're going to be checking each one of these hinges, which appear to be in very good condition, as well as the travel of the stabilator and any of the hardware that's attached to it inside the tail. Everything looks good. Now we're moving up to the rudder. The rudder's in good shape, and we'll move back around the tail and into the fuselage again. The front of the stabilator's in good shape. This side of the aircraft, including the emergency locating antenna right here, in good shape, and we've just gone full circle around this whole aircraft. The conclusion of a good pre-flight is very important to a successful and safe trip. We've done that on this Cherokee Archer. We're ready to go. There are more pre-flight items to take care of in the cockpit when we get out to the runway in terms of a run-up to determine if the engine's running well. But I think you have the idea. It's not just getting into an airplane and flying away. It's thorough checks, good pre-flight, good planning, that make general aviation as safe as it is today.
For someone who's interested in learning to fly, the cost is probably the biggest issue. Wouldn't it be nice if every pilot could afford to own and maintain his or her own plane? But there are some options. One option is to join a non-profit flying club. Sue Giuseppetti talked with Mike Pelletier, president of the Rochester Flying Club.
The Rochester Flying Club holds an annual open house at its hangars on Scottsville Road, usually during the month of May. Here, would-be pilots or pilots are given information about the club, such as benefits, costs, and dues. They are also given the opportunity to inspect the planes one by one. Aside from owning your own plane, pilots at the Rochester Flying Club say belonging to a club such as this is one of the most economical ways to go. I'm here with Mike Pelletier, who is president of the Rochester Flying Club. Mike, can you explain to us what the Rochester Flying Club does and what the benefits are to its pilots?
Well, basically, we are a non-profit organization, and we've been in operation for 30 years. We feel that we offer a pilot the most economical way to flying aircraft. And what we do is we have a membership of very conscientious and able pilots who are interested in safety. And what we do is we all share equal costs on operating our particular fleet. There is no salaries involved. It's just operational type maintenance of the club and its equipment. And we do that for a cost that's at least 1/3 up to 1/2 the cost of what normally you would from the other traditional means, which is a fixed base operator or owning your own aircraft in a single or multiple party limited partnership. Well, currently we have 5 aircraft. We have a high-performance Beechcraft Bonanza, which is a retractable gear and a constant speed prop. Then we have 3 Piper Archer 2s, which are 4-seat fixed gear, fixed prop. And then we have a Cessna 150 trainer aircraft.
And how does the club work exactly? Do pilots get a certain amount of time, airtime per year?
No, what it is we have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week answering service, and it's based on first come, first serve. All the pilots have the aircraft available to them. They just call, reserve the aircraft. There are very few restrictions. Again, our philosophy is one of all our members use and maintain the aircraft as if it was their personal aircraft. And by and large, our members do exactly that. We maintain our aircraft to very high standards. We constantly improve them, and we keep them in top shape.
Is there a limit to the amount of time that a pilot in the club could use the aircraft, for instance, if they went on a trip?
We have a limit of 16 consecutive days that a member can reserve an aircraft for long-term trips, such as going cross-country or an extended stay down in Florida or things of that nature. Beyond that, then it gets one of availability for the membership as a whole, and that's a type of polite way of saying if you're going to do something along those lines, be considerate of the other members who also want to fly. If we go beyond 16 days, then you just apply to the club officers for approval. That rarely happens. Most people do what they're going to do well within those limits.
What do you see as the greatest benefit to a pilot belonging to the club aside from the economical benefits?
Aside from the economical benefits, the best thing is operating very well equipped, extremely well maintained, versatile aircraft, and having 5 of them available for use at any one time. It's consistency of the approach, having a lot of members with a good camaraderie available to help in training and practice and going on trips, sharing costs. We're a happy club.
Down to the nitty-gritty, how do people pay for this?
Well, basically, our costs are split up into 2 structures. A fixed cost, which means those expenses which would incur if the aircraft didn't fly. And the second half of it would be the flying expenses that they use when they actually do fly, such as the answering service, the telephone, the corporate insurance policy that we have in all our members. Those type of expenses are on a monthly basis, and everyone shares in them equally. The flying expenses basically are just that. We have a computerized billing system, and the people make out the log sheets for their flying time, and they are billed according to the type of aircraft that they use and the time they used. Have them flux in and out. I mean, pilots are just like anything else. Some people come into it because they really want to be into it, and other people are into it because they have a goal in life. They want to be a pilot. They get their license and they use it a few times, and they say, well, I did my goal. If they have a real need for it, it's different. Then they come in, they go on trips, they do this, they do that, and it ends up, they stay.
Another option for a would-be pilot is to rent an airplane. Bill Law Aviation is one example.
Bill Law was born in California, raised in Buffalo, and moved to Rochester about 20 years ago.
Basically, when I was a kid, I used to go out to the airport like all young kids and sit on a fence and decided that's what I want to do. And my career has become involved with flying. And I went to an aviation-related high school, and then after Vietnam, I went to a actual flight school in Florida and got all my ratings and kind of jumped in both feet. I was a intelligence specialist, and I flew in the back of bird dogs as an aerial observer and forward bomb damage estimator. I was up in the Hue Phu Bai area, Da Nang north up to the DMZ with the 101st Airborne. I've been in every outlying field and chief pilot for several of the facilities. The one before I went on my own business was the one for Ray Highland School of Aeronautics. I was their chief flight instructor as well as their chief pilot. And in '81 I went off on my own and started my own business. I kind of have a wide variety. We go from a Grumman Tiger to a Piper Cherokee to a Cessna 150, Archers. We have a whole one-stop shopping concept here at the school, and also for the rental business. Basically, Law Aviation is a flight school, a charter department, aircraft sales, and aircraft consulting. My maintenance is done primarily through Beauchard Enterprises in Batavia, but Will Air in Rochester also helps with the workload. We lease about 60% of our airplanes are leasebacks. Our charter flights range usually in about a 700-mile radius in the northeast section. However, we do on occasion go to places like Florida and New Orleans and down playing golf at the Carolinas, but mostly the business folks usually are about a 700-mile radius.
The charter flights at Law Aviation mostly involve business executives.
It seems like with the advent of the many different types of airline services now in business that it has become a lot less favorable for a businessman to go from here to, let's say, Binghamton. A lot of times he has to go from here to Pittsburgh, wait for 2 hours, then go to Binghamton, have the meeting, go back to Pittsburgh, where in my operation I take them right to Binghamton in a 30-minute flight and have them back here in time for lunch or dinner in most cases.
For this day and age of hub activity at most major airlines, Bill Law drew a comparison between scheduled airlines and charter flights.
It's very comparable with the fact that you've got the convenience of the aircraft on station. It's not competitive with the fact that, say, if you compare them apples to apples, because you're using a group type carrier versus your own personalized airplane transportation.
The flight school aspect of Law Aviation has people from all walks of life.
We have people that work for Kodak, we have machinists, we have teachers. It's a wide variety, laborers. Everybody seems to like to fly, and the pilots, once they start, usually get what we call the aviation bug, and they continue on. Flight instructors are usually from this area. We try to employ from the Rochester area. I have employed instructors from as far away as Sweden. Sweden, the country. The operation is one that's it's a very transitional situation. Most people start with a flight instructor mode after they get their ratings, build time, and then transition to the commuter airlines. So we see them come and go on a regular basis. We offer everything up through airline transport pilot multi-engine. We have our own seaplane base based in the Irondequoit Bay area, and all the different ground ratings necessary to achieve the flight ratings. We have 2 seaplanes at the present time. We have a Pacer on floats, which is our training machine, and then we have a Skyhawk that was converted by Penn Yan to 180 horsepower. We call it the Super Hawk, and that's what we use for rental. It's a sightseeing situation mostly. And what we do is we just go ahead and we'll contract somebody to pick them up at Irondequoit Bay and take them around the Finger Lakes and land back to Irondequoit Bay. We don't do a charter situation per se.
Although Law Aviation has been successful, Bill Law likes to treat each individual who uses his business as an important person.
We have grown in size over the years that we haven't forgot the person with the name. And we like to pride ourselves on the fact that we don't have a number here. Everybody's treated as a name and everybody's special to us.
Any pilot, or even someone with just an interest in flying, might want to be involved in issues that affect general aviation. The Rochester Pilots Association is an organization for these people in the Rochester area. Dennis Cristiano is the president.
The Rochester Pilots Association is a group of aviation enthusiasts, pilots, and people in the Rochester area that really support general aviation and its activities here in the Rochester Monroe County Airport. We are advocates of a strong general aviation presence here in the greater Rochester area. We feel that lobbying is very important. However, we also are safety-minded. We do a tremendous number of safety programs for our pilots. And we hope that through the approach of safety and educating legislators and media people about what general aviation is and what flying is in general, that we can have a positive effect on the community. Our membership is a varied lot. That we have airline pilots, and we have pipe fitters, and everywhere in between. I think that flying is a Walter Mitty fantasy for many people. And those of us that are lucky enough to be able to actually fly airplanes are together, and we can hangar fly, as they say, which is talking about airplanes and flying. Those of us that can't fly are around people that can tell them what it's like or take them for rides, and do a lot in that vein. General aviation, though, isn't just a bunch of people that get out on Saturdays, kick the tires, light the fires, and go flying. General aviation is much, much more than that. Anything that's a non-scheduled carrier is basically general aviation. And by that I mean people that go out and fly agricultural missions, dusting and spraying. The state police helicopter is general aviation. General aviation covers Kodak flying, any kind of corporate aviation, charters. At night, many aircraft out of this airport fly cargo, and that cargo is everything from bank checks to Kodak film. We have a tremendous amount of activity that happens here that people are just not aware of, and positive things for this community.
Western New York is rich with options for people interested in flying. There are clubs at some of the regional airports, a balloon organization, and gliders fly out at Dansville. Sue Giuseppetti has a report about just a few other options.
Hundreds of boaters enjoy Lake Ontario and neighboring waterways during the summer. But as any local can tell you, Rochester weather is bound to change on a moment's notice, just as it did today with the fog behind us. You can't even hardly see the water. If you were a boater in trouble, you could count on the Coast Guard to help rescue you. But if you were out in this vast expanse of water, it may be difficult for them to find you. And that's when the Sunset Patrol might be able to help. I'm Susan Giuseppetti. Joining us for Aviation Highlights today is Chief Steve Oliver of the local Coast Guard. We also have today Marcia and David Gittleman. Dave Gittleman is the Air Operations Officer for the Sunset Patrol. Marcia, his wife, is also a volunteer. Chief, can you tell us what is the Sunset Patrol and how did the program come about in this area?
Well, the actual Sunset Patrol is a term we use for an aircraft overflight of the operational area which we're responsible for at the hour just before sunset. That is the Sunset Patrol.
And what does the Sunset Patrol do?
The Sunset Patrol would enable us to possibly sight vessels that was in distress, possibly anchored with a distress flag up, and the pilot would be able to notify the station via radio if they sighted one of these vessels. We could dispatch a rescue vessel. The auxiliary is total volunteers, the surface ops with their vessels, and the air operations with using their own planes. The aircrafts and any auxiliaries that offer their facilities for use are reimbursed for their fuel costs, meal costs while they're on orders, and at the same time their facility is becomes a vessel of the United States, and we insure it as such.
In order for an individual to volunteer, they have to be a member, obviously, of a unit, as I'm a member of Unit 4-5. They do not have to be an aircraft owner, however, that helps. The pilot minimum qualifications are 400 hours of pilot and command time, and then you have to fly at least 2 hours a month to maintain proficiency, and that you do on your own. There are some basic tests that you take for the auxiliary so that you understand what the problems of the boaters are, and so that you can communicate with the people here and we are in constant radio communication when we're flying.
The sunset patrols give the boaters a sense of confidence. They know that if something should happen, that there'll be somebody on patrol looking for somebody who could possibly have a problem, and in short order we would be able to relay to the Coast Guard their position, and the Coast Guard can go out in their surface vessels and aid them.
One of the most exciting forms of flying demonstrated is called aerobatic or sport aerobatics. This home video was shot by Chuck Kruger, a local sport aerobatic pilot.
Okay, Chuck, can you tell us a little bit about the Acrobatic Flying Club?
Okay, we're based out at the Perry-Warsaw Airport. We're just a small local organization right now that we're trying to expand and get a little bit larger. We're having our meetings on Saturdays out at the airport at 2 o'clock. What we're trying to do is promote aerobatics in the area and safe flying in general. Aerobatics makes you a better pilot. Learn to fly the airplane around all three axes. On a Pitts S1S, it's a single-seat airplane, and it weighs about 730 pounds, has about 200 horsepower, and it performs very well right up through the unlimited level competition. There's 4 levels of competition: sportsman, intermediate, advanced, and unlimited. And as you go up, the maneuvers get more difficult. And
what would be an example of a beginner kind of maneuver that you would learn to do?
Okay, the sportsman sequence, you typically do things like loops, hammerheads, slow rolls, and half Cuban 8s, that kind of thing. As you progress up into like unlimited, which is the top class, now you're doing things like tail slides, where the airplane actually goes vertically straight up and then falls over backwards. Torque rolls, where you roll continuously up and then the airplane continues to roll as it comes back down. So plus you get lower. In sportsman, you don't do any maneuvers at a contest below about 1,500 feet, where unlimited, you're down to about 300 feet off the ground. Instruction.
And what about the plane? Do you need a special plane?
Some of the older airplanes, the Cubs and Taylor Crafts and things like that, can do aerobatics and Centabrias and compete in the sportsman, maybe up to the intermediate level.
I'm here with Bill Shaw, who is the past treasurer of the Experimental Aviation Association. Can you explain to us what experimental aircraft is?
Primarily an experimental aircraft is one who is the only one of its kind. There is no what they call standard certification or certificate of airworthiness for experimental aircraft. The type of certification they have is what they call experimental, and as such have different rules for building. They are required to be inspected by the FAA to make sure they meet certain minimum standards. Then when the airplane is built, the FAA licenses it to fly, or certifies it to fly, and then the person has to be confined within a certain area for so many hours before they'll approve him for flying elsewhere.
I'm here with Phil Hayes, who is one of the coordinators of the aviation show here today at Greasetown Mall. And we're standing in front of Phil's ultralight.
Ultralights have been around for probably about the last 10 years. The FAA defines an ultralight now as being an aircraft that weighs no more than 254 pounds, can fly no faster than 63 miles an hour. It's allowed to carry 5 gallons of fuel, only one person, and it doesn't require a license. It's strictly a recreational plane for a lot of fun.
It doesn't require a license, so does that mean it doesn't fall under federal aviation regulations?
No, it still falls under what we call FAR 103, which is a guideline that the FAA has given us to allow us this privilege, if you will, of flying airplanes, but without a lot of the expense and complications of medical exams, expensive flight schools, and things of that nature. We still recommend that people get instruction to learn how to fly these things safely, but we don't have a lot of the overhead.
Now, where would they get instruction to learn, and how much would instruction cost? Is it the same as going through a pilot's training?
No, instruction is probably going to cost you $50 to $100. There's a flight school down in Horseheads that is kind of the ultralight hub of New York State, if you will, where they provide safe training in 2-seater ultralights that have been specially modified.
Today we're going to tell you about one woman who is part of a quietly successful network of pilots across the country who give of their time and effort to help needy families. This nonprofit organization provides medical transports
for patients who have been drained of financial resources and have nowhere else to turn. Air Lifeline was founded by Tom Goodwin, a Sacramento, California businessman and private pilot who thought he had a good idea for putting to work small private planes that had been sitting idle. But before his idea could be put into operation, Goodwin needed a clearly defined purpose. He also needed pilots.
Well, air ambulances charge for one thing, and they can provide more services for an indigent person. The only thing that Air Lifeline can provide is oxygen if a patient needs it. Otherwise, they have to be able to get in and out of the plane by themselves and to be able to sit in the seat.
Carol has flown 3 missions for Air Lifeline. While there are more than 450 Air Lifeline pilots nationwide, there are only 22 in New York. Of these, Carol and her husband are the only pilots in this area who volunteer for the program.
Can you tell us, how did you hear about Air Lifeline and why did you volunteer for it?
I read about it, I think in one of the 99's newsletters at one time, just about a meeting that they had had, or some aviation publication, and called, they had George Benedict's name. He's a man who lives up along the Hudson in New York State, and he coordinates all the Air Lifeline flights, missions, we call them, for this state in this area.
Along with the uniqueness of the nature of this volunteer act, there is another reason that this program is so special. Pilots like Carol not only give of their time and skill, but they are not even reimbursed for 1 penny of the cost of flying the plane.
While the pilots are not reimbursed, the costs that they incur are tax deductible. But, as Carol says, pilots who fly for Air Lifeline are not concerned about being compensated.
Carol, how does that make you feel to be able to do that for those people?
Well, it makes you feel wonderful that you can help them out because they have so many medical bills to take care of, and it's very difficult for them to get transportation, to be able to afford to get transportation to go where they need to go for their medical treatment. So it's very nice to be able to help someone else out, and by using your skills as a pilot and your plane. It's very nice.
The ability to land an airplane on either land or water is one that fascinates me.
Ed Pavir lives on the shore of Canandaigua Lake where he keeps his amphibious aircraft.
Well, the airplane is a 4-place, a 4-passenger, single engine, of course. The engine, is, you can see, is on top of the airplane. It's a mid-wing airplane, and it's the only amphibious airplane now in production, I believe, in the United States. Now, there are certainly different kinds of airplanes that land in water. Most of them we think of are the high-wing airplane type that people put the floats on, pontoons. And those would be the Cessnas and the high-wing Pipers and Mauls and that sort of configuration. This airplane is designed for both water and land use, and it lands on its belly. So in essence, it's more like a flying boat. It lands on the hull, and therefore the hull is a good deal stronger than the hull of a conventional land airplane. And as you can see, or we'll take a look at, it's shaped like a boat. It has a V-type construction with splash rails and what we call a step underneath the center of gravity that the airplane actually rides on when it's in the water and it's moving across the top of the water. It holds 40 gallons of fuel, burns about 9.5 gallons of fuel at cruise. So I plan about 3.5-hour legs on trips. Now, I've flown the airplane from coast to coast. I've probably done as many landings and takeoffs in it as anybody that flies lakes. And it's a really good handling airplane in the aviation community. You'll hear critics talk about various things. As far as clearances or flight plans, the same regulations would apply on water as they would on land if on a day like today, for instance, when the weather is severe clear, there's no flight plan required, and basically one announces his intentions on a frequency that's reserved for non-controlled fields. And if the weather is bad and I'm taking a trip someplace, then I'll call the Buffalo Flight Service and file an instrument flight plan, and they give me a departure time. And basically what that means is that I'll take off at the time they specify, and then I have to contact them by radio within a certain period of time or at a certain location in order to receive my clearance and to continue on the trip. So I basically have to stay. If I take off here and fly to the north end of the lake, I can talk to Rochester departure, for instance, before I'm even off the water. So I can fly 50 feet off the water until I talk to them. So if I had to land, I could land again. But once I receive the clearance, then I can climb right up into the instrument weather and go wherever I'm going. There is no landing pattern per se. Now, at specific seaplane bases, there may be, and they may be published. But on a body of water like this, where there isn't any specific runway or landing area, you're basically landing into the wind. So the pilot approaches the body of water looking at signs of wind direction, which would be streaks that run parallel with the wind, and then looking at the shoreline to look for the calm water at the shoreline to determine which way the wind is blowing up and down those streaks. There's other signs, of course. You'll see sailboats moored out, flags on docks, and that sort of thing. Sailboats that are out sailing in the lake, you can get a cue from how the sail is filled. And then basically finding a place that's large enough to set the airplane down.
Here's a little bit of history of the Rochester Airport with Paul Roxin.
In 1936, there was a big project underway where they started to put in concrete runways at the airport, modernization of the airport, under the WPA program. And the airport was really a mess. You had to be very careful where you taxied. Very often you had to taxi on a runway and look out for planes that are going to land, because if you got off that run, you dropped down 12 feet, things of that nature. But we were in expansion mode, and it was unfortunate. Politics got in the way of the development of the airport here, because the federal government, which was a Democratic administration under Roosevelt, they wanted to put in a new administration, give the county, not the county, but the city, all the money to put up a new administration building on Brooks Avenue, where we are now. And because the city was Republican, they wouldn't play ball. And unfortunately, we all lost out in that particular respect, where other cities went ahead and put up new administration buildings. So we fell behind quite a bit. The first control, may be interesting to had divulged some information how the control tower evolved here at the airport. We had no control tower at all, and one night, Clarence Robinson, who ran a flying service here, had a charter trip in his brand new Stinson. It was only 2 weeks old, and he was returning from Buffalo at night. Elmer Page was hauling passengers for Ray Holland, and the two met at an intersection of two runways. They were both on the ground, both doing maybe about 15 miles an hour. And the Waco, propeller of the Waco chewed about 2 feet off the wing of Clarence Robinson, brand new Stinson rated lined. Well, Robinson was livid with anger, and he sued Holland. Holland countersued, and the two lawyers got together and said, hey, wait a minute, it's nobody's fault, really. At night, what you need here is a control tower. There's no control tower here. So the city immediately instituted proceedings for putting a control tower in operation, and it was at low, like a chicken coop on top where the Weather Bureau is located at the present time. When all we had was a light, no radio, you had for approach, you had a green light if the coast was clear, a red light if you were to take it around again, or for red and alternate red and green light, if I remember correctly, you're to change runway. Well, this went on. It was sort of a haphazard type of an operation, and was not. But that tower was used for about, maybe 15, 16 months, and then there was another collision. Once again involved Elmer Page and Doc Watson, who was a physician who had his own Fairchild 24, Dr. James Sibley Watson was his full name. And it was nobody's fault, really. Elmer was given a green light to make an approach. The tower operator never saw Doc Watson because the brick, you had there was a blind spot in that tower, and he never saw it. Well, the two came together about 15 feet above the ground. And Doc Watson's plane sustained, landing gear was wiped out, plane was setting up on its nose, gasoline pouring from the carburetor, and I can't remember what happened to the Waco. I don't think there was damage too badly. And then once again the airport realized we need a control tower that has 360 degrees unlimited vision. So they put up a temporary control tower for only 60 days. That was in 1936. And that control tower remained in operation until, instead of 60 days, until 1949. And that control tower is now in front of the administration building on Brooks Avenue. It was 40 feet high. And they installed some radio equipment in there. But there was one problem with that control tower. And that was when you had a pretty good wind, the thing used to rock back and forth. And one of the tower operators would get seasick, or airsick, or tower sick, whatever, and he'd have to come down. There'd be nobody in the tower. Occupational hazard.
Here at the National Warplane Museum in Geneseo, the members have great reason to be proud of their accomplishments. They put in long hours, often with no pay.
During quieter times, the Geneseo Airport's grass-strip runways remind many World War II pilots of the old English countryside in the early 1940s. It was from those runways that the Allied Air Forces launched their aerial attacks against Nazi and Nazi-occupied territories. These are some of the airplanes that helped to win freedom from the Axis armies all over the world. These airplanes were on display, on the ground and in the air, at the 1989 Wings of Eagles Air Show. The National Warplane Museum in Geneseo is dedicated to aviation preservation and education. Bill Lau is a member of the museum and one of the air show's announcers.
We have 3,000 plus members right now. Many of them volunteer here at the museum. And the museum has exactly 5 paid staff members, most of whom work in the office. It's a very, very unique organization in that regard, and it's one of the things that I enjoy about it, quite frankly, is that the volunteer support is what makes the place work. It's people who love what they're doing.
What do you think it is about the museum that attracts most people to be so heavily involved?
There are a number of things, I think. I think the first thing that's most attractive to most people is the airplanes themselves. They're magnificent machines. During World War II, this country built 300,000 warplanes. And today, we have cases, for instance, in the case of the P-40s, 14,000 made, and just 10 are still flying in the whole country. The B-17s, 13,000 were made. Granted, 5,000 were lost in combat, but today in this country, only about 9 of those still fly. And in fact, in the whole world, about only 50 are known to exist. So it is the machines themselves and the need to preserve them. For me personally, it's a sense of history. The aircraft played a very vital part in this country being what it is today, and I think we learn from them about that history, and we also, in seeing them, I think, remember what went on during that time. A lot of people died. There was a lot of anger in the world, and the airplanes serve as a reminder of that time so that we should not do it again. Someone made that famous quote, "We are doomed to repeat our history if we forget it." And we don't want people to forget it. And that really, I think, is the attraction for me.
The National Warplane Museum at Geneseo is especially noted for its possession of a B-17 Flying Fortress fuddy-duddy. Bill Lau talks about it.
It was 1985, as a matter of fact. The B-17, which we own, was a plane that was built by Douglas back in 1945. I'll give you a little history of the aircraft. It was built in 1945, which was toward the end of the war, so it never actually saw combat. In fact, the aircraft that are now flying of the B-17s, none of them were ever actually in combat in this country anyway. And what happened was it was sent to a depot in the Pacific, sat out the rest of the war, and then was converted into a VIP transport. Among others, General MacArthur and General Eisenhower used this aircraft as a transport when it was in the military service. From there, it went to a company called Globair in Mesa, Arizona, and for better than 20 years was used by Globair as a fire bomber. Now this, of course, meant that it was stripped still further of its military gear. So the airplane was basically right down to bare bones when they were using it, and right before we got it, it was assigned the ultimate fate of most aircraft that get old and were military aircraft at one time. It was a crop sprayer, a bug sprayer. It had booms mounted under the wings, and it would fly over and spray bugs. When we got it, it smelled of malathion inside, something terrible. We've only just finally started getting rid of that odor in the aircraft. In 1985, Globair had 4 of these. They were, I believe, the last 4 that were in commercial operation in this country, and they discovered that they were getting very expensive to operate. So they decided to sell them at auction down in Mesa, Arizona, and we heard about it. We checked out this particular airplane. When I say we, others from the museum, and they went down and bid on it. They purchased it for $250,000 and brought it back here, flew it back here. And since that time, we have been trying to restore the airplane to its original glory, which has meant, putting turrets back on it, putting guns in it, changing the nose glass, repainting it. The aircraft is painted as one that, another airplane that flew with the 447th Bomb Group out of Rattlesnake, England during the war in 1943, and it was named Fuddy Duddy. And the reason that we selected that name was because this aircraft had the distinction of flying 96 missions without an abort. In other words, 96 times able to go out and drop the bombs and come back without having to turn back. On its 97th mission, though, the original Fuddy Duddy collided with another B-17 over Mannheim and was lost, along with all but 2 of the members of that crew. There are, however, about 16 members surviving from the first 3 crews, and in 1987, when we dedicated the aircraft and named Fuddy Duddy, we had them in here, and they had a glorious weekend with the airplane. I might also mention that Dominic Zapparo is one of the original crew members from Fuddy Duddy. He happens to be a member of our museum, lives right down in Leicester, right close to the museum. And that also is partly how we came to choose the name Fuddy Duddy for our aircraft.
The National Warplane Museum also has a PBY Catalina in its collection. This amphibious airplane is very well remembered for rescuing thousands of downed airmen from oceans and beaches in all theaters of the world.
As you probably know, most people seem to think that all it did was a rescue mission, picking up people out of the water and everything, but if you've read anything on it, you're aware that it did quite a job as a bomber, patrol bomber. Sank something like 7 million tons of Japanese shipping in the Southwest Pacific. It just did a tremendous amount of work. It was probably the most widely used airplane of all the services combined in the world. It was in about every country in the world, all the way around the world. We even, at one time, we sold 30 of them to Russia. And shortly after they took possession of the 30, we even licensed to manufacture the PBY in Russia, which they did. How many they ever made, we don't know, because they never released them. There may be a whole bunch of these things sitting around Russia somewhere, too. Although I was over there about 6 months ago and tried to find some, I never ran across them.
How did the Warplane Museum come to acquire this particular PBY?
It was found down in Florida, and one of the members by the name of Young, Ansel Young, I think it was the guy that found it. And it was somewhat of a derelict at that time. We have pictures of it. It was pretty bad shape. And he was interested, and he was an ex-PBY navigator, pilot, co-pilot during World War II. And I guess he got some of the people together here, and he had some money, and they wound up buying it down there. He ferried it up here, and it's been here ever since.
Well, during World War II, I believe of all the enemy submarines sunk, about half of them were sunk by PBYs. They accounted for almost half of them. Well, engine parts are available. It uses the same engine as the old DC-3. So there's a lot of those flying yet, so there are engines around. But it's a constant battle, though. You're always fixing something on it. And well, we had to change an engine last June, and we found one within a week, had it on in 2 weeks.
That's Aviation Highlights. For Dennis Cristiano and Sue Giuseppetti, I'm Paul Pakusch. Thank you for watching.